Hi, James. Thank you so much for being here today. And I'm so thrilled to have you as a guest on Unfounded.
It's my
Our
pleasure.
topic today is controlling the narrative. And when it comes to talking about startups and storytelling and innovation and the powerful role that it plays in entrepreneurial culture, I couldn't think of anyone that I wanted to have this conversation with more than you. And as you know, we have 3 questions that we're going to ask each other about stories and startups. One looks to the past, one speaks to the present, and the third leans into the future. And as you also know, we've given each other a sneak peek into the questions about the past and the present, but the third question, the one about the future, that's the wild card. And we have not shared that with each other in advance. No formal bios on the show. So for anyone watching or listening, you can read more about James in the show note. His amazing work as the former editor-in-chief of Inc. magazine, as an author of a super fun book about gold and the gold standard. And also now his work as the publisher of Fin, where James goes bananas over all things fintech. But instead of reading bios, I've asked James to pick 3 words to describe himself before we jump into the conversation. So James,
Great.
3 words.
It's funny. The episodes that I listen to, people tend to go for adjectives. And for whatever reason, my mind goes to nouns. So my 3 words are nouns. Writer, which, you kind of indicated. Motivator, which I tried to make that about, being a boss and a mentor, but also a father. And empath. I think a lot of the power that I can bring to the work that I do comes from really trying to figure out what makes people tick and what they're feeling and what they're going through. So those are my 3 words.
Again, I'm not supposed to comment, but I'm going to. I remember the first night I met you, I think I literally cornered you and blocked your egress. We were both judging a startup competition together, and just to chat with you. And I remember thinking damn, that guy is funnier and a lot nicer than I expected a newsman to be. So I know no one needs my affirmation on their 3 words, but I do think not only is empathy an incredible tool when you are a storyteller, but you're genuinely kind of funny and you kind of are empathetic. So yeah, good for you for not lying to the audience and making up words about yourself that weren't true. Well done, sir. Well done. All right, get in your time machine, James. I'm
Okay.
going to take you into the past and ask you to look backwards for this question. So stories need good characters, and good storytellers have to evaluate whether or not a character is going to be strong enough, right, to carry the audience all the way through. Looking back, what are some of the qualities and characteristics that were most likely to make you want to write a story about a founder? And then on the other side of that, do you still find the same qualities equally compelling today?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And to be honest, when you sent it to me, it got me thinking not only about stories about founders, although I want to talk about that too, but also patterns of narratives that seem to draw me in. But definitely, at Inc., one of the things that always jazzed me the most, there are two qualities that are often closely related. One is that I'm a sucker for a great immigrant story. I think this is the American in me that gets really, really jazzed about the idea of someone coming to this country with nothing or next to nothing, facing tremendous obstacles, and making something work on the basis of their own insights and their own intuitions. I literally just interviewed a guy last week who came here with his mother from Nigeria, settled in Minnesota, and his mother really wanted him to go to college, but they didn't have any money. And they went to the big bank in Minneapolis and they had no credit history, right? Because you're an immigrant, you don't have anything on the books. And so she had to fund his education through payday loans, paying 400% a year. So he's invented this app that allows people who rent to have their timely rental payments, and his company manages the payments to the landlord.
Oh,
and
like recorded.
Feeds that into credit bureaus so they can build credit history through rental,
by paying rent.
which wasn't even legally possible until a few years ago. So those kinds of stories, I have to say, give me chills, and I will never get tired of them. And then there's a sort of subset of that is overcoming adversity. is just a great quality of a character. You know, the structuralist literary critics will tell you they're really only like 6 or 7 stories, right? And one is beating the monster, and so the overcoming that adversity, you know, facing bankruptcy in the eyes, and you know, finding a way to make it work. I think those are really great stories. But what your question also reminded me about the books that I've published, it's not true for all of them, but it's true for a lot of them, is that I seem to be drawn to highly idealistic plans that don't work. So and kind of telling the story of how they fall apart. So my first book was a history of public television, to some degree public radio, but mostly public television. And it, you know, it goes into these ideals that were laid out in 1967 when the Public Broadcasting Act was founded, you know, that it would be commercial free and that it would be highly educational and all that stuff. And we end up with, you know, Yanni Live as part of a PBS fundraiser, right? And
on an all-day telethon.
All-day telethon with Ted Nugent, you know, and it's sort of the opposite of, and all of it, you know, all of which is sort of indistinguishable at this point from 17 other cable channels. Sort of telling that story. The second one was about the magazine where I worked called the Industry Standard, which, you know, in the year 2000 sold more ad pages than any magazine in the history of America, and 8 months later was bankrupt, and kind of how that fell apart. So I seem to be drawn to these, you know, there are certain kind of writers who want to, you know, kind of elevate and create heroes, and I seem to be drawn to a certain kind of messy details and anti-heroes. So that's my answer.
Yeah, it's a good one. All right, James, your turn. Take me to the past.
So you as a investor have looked at hundreds, maybe thousands of startups over the years. How important would you say that story is compared to, you know, all the other things, CEO leadership, the innovation of the idea, the business model, the funding, the team, and then what do you do, assuming you do think it's important, or we wouldn't be having this conversation, what do you do with an otherwise compelling company or founder when the story just isn't so sharp?
Yeah, literally thousands. And I think it's not just actually about attracting investors. The story is the skin that holds an early stage company together. Without it, you're just a bag of bones. Most of it's a story. And I think in some ways that's at the root of a lot of the inequity that we've had in startup culture. Is there are those who fit the molds of the stories that we like the best. And then there are those that get a lot of informal training on how to be confident, good storytellers. And then there are lots of entrepreneurs who have really good ideas, but for a variety of reasons, either have not yet been trained on how to tell the story that we like as investors or the story that others like. I also think it's very important to building capacity, building organization. I mean, you've hired a lot of people in your day. They come to work with you because they like the story that you've told them about what working with you is going to be like. So I think story is probably more important than almost anything else, particularly when you think about the vast majority of companies are not reinventing the wheel. What they're doing is something interesting around value delivery, business model. And so the story really is the secret ingredient. It's the story that's going to determine if you attract the right things to you. And then there's also, of course, the market facing side of the story. How do you get the people that you want to sell to excited about what you do? I think I have noted in my career a lot of inequities in how stories get rewarded and how sometimes we get stuck in our own patterns. So you just talked about your patterns. There were a lot of patterns, I think, in startup Gen 1 where every story had to fit this pattern. I mean, there are downloadable templates on how to build your pitch. And I think that there's some good in that, but there was a lot of bias into that too, about what you're willing to say, how you're willing to say it, and how performative you're willing to be in describing yourself as an entrepreneur. I think we're working our way back now to recognize that there's something in between a story that matches a template that a small group of people think is the right template, and an authentic way for an entrepreneur to tell the story about their business, where it is, where it's going, and why anyone should give two fucks about it. I think I spend a lot of my time, not only as a fund manager, as an investor, but in a lot of my advisory and mentorship roles, I find myself gravitating towards helping founders tell better stories at different stages of their journey. And these days, I spend a lot of time working with first-time founders, women, and people of color, really trying to unlock for them more confidence in their ability to recognize the dynamic tension between aligning with the patterns to get what you want, but finding an authentic comfort in how you tell your story so that you can continue to yield the rewards from that downstream. If your story is totally made up and full of crap and you don't love it, I'm going to figure that out pretty fast. So I spend a lot of time going back and forth with founders about that speculative gap between where you are and where you're going, and who you are and who you're becoming, and why anyone should care, and the importance of timing and doing an incredible amount of hard work there. To me, it's the most joyful part of innovation and startups in general, is actually the unwritten parts that you get to write when you can build a good story around an idea. And that's my answer. So, okay, back to today. We're going to talk about the present. It's kind of similar to kind of where we were. So one of the most exciting, but I also think challenging things about telling the stories of startups, entrepreneurship, and innovation is that you're often documenting and describing things that only partially exist, right? If they exist at all outside of a mental construct, right? And I think that there's a line that the storyteller walks, both the founder and in the case of a professional storyteller like yourself, there's a line that you walk between the kind of what's tangible, what's actualized, and what's by, I think, definition more ethereal. And I'm curious to hear a little bit about how you have walked that line and how you try to think about positioning yourself, understanding that by definition, innovative entrepreneurial things are not all written in stone. It comes with the territory. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Somewhere near the height of the dot-com boom, Michael Wolff said something to me that has always stuck with me, that the line between an ambitious entrepreneur who believes in herself and fraud is a fairly thin line, because you have to be able to sell people on the existence of a product or service that may not yet exist, and or may exist in a very, very raw and imperfect form, and expect them to get in bed with you. And I worked for a while at Sequoia Capital, and this was really one of the most fascinating aspects of the job to me. Like, when I am writing a story about a company or editing a story about a company, I know in my own mind what the yardsticks are for, is this a successful company or not, right? Like, how many people have they hired? Do they have patents? Are their revenues growing? Are they profitable? All these things. And I feel comfortable with those yardsticks. Watching the VCs at Sequoia, it's like, what do you do when it's two guys and an idea, right? Like, not only do they not have revenues, they don't have a product. They haven't yet written a line of code. So it is literally just a dream that will be pursued by money and engineers, basically. And it really is. I mean, it's an almost religious experience, in the sense that it takes a leap of faith to be able to see these things. And it's one reason why I think we revere entrepreneurs in this culture, because they have the vision to see things that no one else sees. But also B, it can be very, very lonely, because literally no one else can see what you're talking about some of the time. And I think you ask, how do you walk that line? I think you just have to kind of close your eyes and walk it, because that tension is never going to go away. If it were all in one direction, if everybody could see it, it wouldn't be interesting and people wouldn't invest in it. But then if on the other extreme, if nobody can see it, then you won't get funding and you won't see the light of day. So I think you just have to buy in as much as you can to the vision, but also try to stay tethered to reality. It's also one of the differences between working for a VC firm and working in journalism. Like, as a journalist, it's a little bit of our job to tear these visions down, or at least throw things at them and see what might stick or blow up. Whereas when you work on the VC side, you're kind of more beating the drum and trying to march in step, which is maybe one reason why I'm back in journalism.
Could be. Could be. I'm not supposed to respond, but when I help founders try to navigate that on the other side, I sometimes describe it as think about telling your story within the boundaries of your shadow. So you're in motion, right? I know you're in motion. You're in motion every day. So think about, where's your shadow? Like, the sun's behind you. You can kind of see, maybe not the best the best sun with a shadow that stretches for as far as the eye can see, but think about your shadow and think about your story being in the being like a little bit beyond where you are, but in the shadow of where you're headed, and to kind of use that as your moral compass to keep you from becoming fraudulent.
Right.
Because you sort of know when you're not in your shadow. I feel like you know if you're honest with yourself, you start to know. And so I sometimes use a shadow metaphor with founders when I try to explain that. So okay, James,
okay,
hit me
so
up
you're
with your
present.
question about the present.
You're present. So you've embarked on this very interesting journey of creating a podcast, which I know is something that you've thought about for a long time. And it itself is a form of storytelling. And I'm curious what you've learned about different storytelling techniques, different storytelling abilities, as well as how do you elicit the best stories from your interlocutors?
Yeah, so I think this is for me, like I've always been interested in storytelling. I started in biological sciences telling those stories because I sucked at actual science. But I always loved the story of science and the narrative of science. And I understood that much more than I understood how to repeatedly measure chemicals over and over again into tiny little test tubes. So I think I really, really believe that story is one of the most powerful tools that humans have to build things, like not just to share information and share knowledge, but I think we build things through story as well. So for me, a lot of the opportunity to put together finally a storytelling platform of my own was a little bit to put my money where my mouth is. I've for many years been telling companies to get better at telling your story, and I've been telling my own stories pretty shittily. It was very self-serving also to get to spend time with my friends who I think are way smarter than me and engage in conversations about topics that I think are really important. And I do think we're living at a time when storytelling is changing. I think some of the old frameworks and some of the limitations of storytelling are fast eroding. There are new voices. We're welcoming, I think, new voices into our storytelling space finally. And I do think that even who gets to tell a story, whose story is validated, how our story is validated is really changing. And I think startup culture in particular is really ready to change. There's been a lot of social proof and social validation and dependency on those things to validate the stories of entrepreneurs. And in many cases, and for many years, it was used to exclude a lot of people from entry. If not explicitly by denying them entry, then implicitly by making them feel very unwelcomed and unwanted and unrepresented. And so I think we are also living at a time when we're trying to strike a balance between letting people have personal truths and personal experiences, but I'm still an empiricist. I believe in science, and I think there are facts. Like I think there are actually facts. I think facts are complicated, and I think particularly with startups, yeah, it's muddy and it's murky, but there is a difference between dreaming and fraud. And I believe that it's not that hard to figure it out if you just decide that you want to. So I'm also excited to think about the next generation of storytelling and how are the old farts going to get out of the way, not to really let the mode change, right? Not just give permission to other people to tell their stories in the ways that we like, but actually start to make space for a new generation of entrepreneurs to tell stories in different ways that we might not like, that just might not match any of our patterns, and we might not even enjoy them and may not want to consume them. And I think you have to almost open yourself up to this idea that you have an expiration date. And that if you want to stay fresh in the fridge, then you better be fresh in the fridge. So it's a little bit of everything, I think about in the context of startup storytelling and the role that I want to play for the next decade of my career in pursuing justice and equity for people who have been excluded, but also doing shit that I love and getting paid to do it and building things that I'm proud of. So I think story, again, is sort of I'm never going to do any of those things without having a good story. So this was my tricycle training wheel run. So there you go.
Excellent.
All right, James, time for another time jump. We are off to the future. Last question. So again, it's like we did share this one in advance, given how much we've covered to date, but we did not. So as a storyteller, you've even selected yourself into this mode, but archetypes are really powerful. And I think the adoration of archetypes was a huge part of startup culture. I think it still is, but it really, really was, I think, looking backwards. And there were a few roles, and you needed to play one of those roles if you wanted to make the news or get the right people to support your company. It was like being in a play at school, and there were only 4 good parts, and the rest was you're in the Greek chorus. And I've often wondered if we were writing the characters or if the characters were writing us, right? That's how it started to feel particularly towards the end of my experience as an equity investor. And I think the obsession with archetypes created a lot of self-serving content with commiserating partners, who had vehicles for disseminating that information. And it really did reinforce a racist, sexist culture in technology for a very long time. A lot of really bad behavior, like fraud, for example, right? And some of it truly criminal. So given all that, and as you sort of now are at a place in your career where you can look forwards and backwards, what advice or warnings would you give to the next generation of storytellers in hopes that we just don't make the same mistakes again?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I haven't been in touch with him in a few years, but an old friend of mine, Sam Sifton, who now runs the food stuff at the New York Times, published this book during the dot-com boom called The Field Guide to the Yeti, the Young Entrepreneurial Technology Individual. And it was like the preppy handbook for startups.
Awesome.
And it had the different archetypes, right? There was like
the hacker, the hustler.
I would be like the crossover geezer. There's the PR bunny. There's the VC, the tech, the programming nerd, and all that stuff. And it was funny, but it was funny because it was ridiculously true.
Yeah, it's true, right?
And it was a wonderful parody of that time. I think my advice would simply be, don't be afraid to forge some new archetypes. I mean, inevitably, because of the way that funding works and because of the way the press works, you will always be straitjacketed to some degree into existing archetypes. But I think there is a hunger out there for new characters, for stories we haven't heard so much about. I was I said at the earlier part of this podcast, just another 25-year-old Nigerian fintech executive is kind of a great story. Like, we don't know that story really. I mean, not too well, certainly not overly familiar. And find a way to reinvent the things that are good about those characters and weed out the things that were less good and less inclusive, as you indicate. I think that would be my advice.
Yeah, I concur. All right, friend.
My future question for you is, what's your story?
What's my story?
You've cashed it all in and moved to the beach. What is next for Melissa?
Yeah, well, so I still have a day job, and it's to run my fund. One of the exciting things about living in this moment is I'm old enough to know what I know and to feel good about what I do, and to know where to put the asterisks and the caveats and be like, I don't actually know about that. Like, I don't win anymore by pretending to be someone that I'm not. And I've shed a lot of my imposter syndrome from the earlier phases of my career, many of which was inspired by the bias in startup storytelling that made me feel like I didn't fit one of those roles, so I probably didn't belong. I'm kind of on the other side of that now. I think as for me and what I do in my day job with my fund is I'm really interested in innovating the capital toolkit. And because I believe that your story is a major driver of how you get capitalized and why you get capitalized, not even because you win people over, but it's the story you tell yourself about what you need to build and what resources you need to get there. It's all and storytelling, right? I think when I think about moving forward, one of the liberating and also terrifying things about where I feel like I am today in my career is the half-life of a business model is really shrinking. And so all the good work that we did on Rev Up V1, V2, V3, you just don't get to sit with it for very long before there's tremendous pressure to do something different. And there's all kinds of new revenue funders in the market, and like bake-offs on who has the cheapest capital. And you really do, it goes back to, what's your fucking story, man? And so for me, I'm like living my own dream/nightmare, where as I think about the next thing and the next fund, I have to go through that narrative reinvention process where I live inside my shadow, but I tell the story about where we're going, and why, and there'll be risk associated with that, right? And why that risk is going to be worth the reward. So I think my story right now is a lot about not getting lazy in just being like claiming victory and being like, oh, you broke through, you finally feel good about yourself, yay, like, oh, you're telling the story of women entrepreneurs, you're a hero. And really see that it's like, that's the tiny pinhole that I finally feel like got pricked. The win is on the other side of the pinhole. I don't want to get stuck behind the pinhole, either with my fund, with the things that I want to do with my partners around revenue-based funding and other kinds of funding for early stage companies, but also around this idea of storytelling, and not just making it making it easier for new founders to tell stories the way we like to hear them, but making it possible for them to tell stories that maybe we don't even want to hear, but making sure that there's opportunities at least for people to hear those stories and form their own reactions to them. So I think my story is a lot more as coming back to a lot more about story. Story, 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 story. I'm like a broken record.
Nice story, bro.
Yeah, that's brah. Well, that's it. We've circumnavigated the world in only 3 questions. And it was, as I fully expected, profoundly enjoyable. I always love talking with you. So thank you. And I can't wait to see you again in person and hear your stories in person and spend time with you, because you are super fun to hang out with.
It will be great. It will be great.
All right.
Okay.